Good evening. Find a comfortable position and let the room go quiet. If you are winding down for the night, this is a good place to do it. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. And let me take you somewhere far from here, somewhere with stone walls and candlelight, and a specific kind of fear that most of us, thankfully, will never have to know. Tonight we are going to the English royal court in the spring of 1536. Specifically, we are going to stand in a corner of the Queen's bedchamber, hands folded, eyes down, wearing silk you did not choose, and serving a woman whose fate you cannot control and cannot escape. You are a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne Boleyn. It is, on paper, one of the most prestigious positions available to a woman in England. It will also, within a matter of weeks, become one of the most dangerous. We are not going to rush toward the ending. We are going to walk through it slowly, the way this story actually unfolded, hour by hour, whisper by whisper, so that by the time we arrive at Tower Green, you understand exactly what it cost the women who stood there. Get settled. The fire is low. We have all night. Tonight we are going to follow a woman, a composite of the real ladies-in-waiting who served in Anne Boleyn's household during the final months of her life, through what may be the single most psychologically brutal position a woman could occupy in Tudor England. Not a servant's role, not a menial post. A position of aristocratic privilege, granted to daughters of noble families as a mark of favour and a route to advancement. And in the spring of 1536, that privilege became a trap. The version most people carry in their heads is almost entirely wrong. It goes something like this. A group of beautiful young women in beautiful dresses, gossiping and giggling behind the Queen's back, enjoying the luxury of court life until the day their mistress was suddenly, shockingly arrested. The truth is stranger and far more frightening. These women lived inside the most surveilled, faction-riven, paranoid political environment in the kingdom, and by 1536, at least some of them had likely been recruited, deliberately and systematically, to report on the Queen's every word. This was not gossip. This was not court intrigue in the playful sense the word usually implies. In Tudor law, simply knowing about treason and failing to report it was itself a crime, which meant that every private conversation Anne Boleyn had in front of her ladies, every joke, every complaint about her husband, every unguarded moment of a marriage under enormous strain, carried the potential to destroy the woman standing beside her. By the time we are finished tonight, you will understand something that most retellings of this story skip entirely. The women who served Anne Boleyn were not merely witnesses to her fall. They were instruments of it. And the line between loyalty and survival for these women was so thin that some of them never figured out which side of it they were standing on until it was far too late. Before we go any further, if this kind of evening suits you, if you like settling in with history that feels like a place you can visit rather than a list to memorize, would you take a moment to subscribe? It helps more than you might think, and it means we can keep making these. And if you want to, tell me in the comments where you are tonight and what time it is where you are. I always read them. Wherever you are, I'm glad you are here. Now, we are going to the English court. We are going to the spring of 1536, when the marriage that had reshaped a kingdom's religion was quietly, invisibly beginning to collapse. And the women closest to the Queen had no idea they were standing inside the blast radius. It is April, and the palaces of the Thames Valley are moving through the restlessness of early spring in England, when the weather cannot decide what season it wants to be, and the court, correspondingly, cannot decide what mood it wants to hold. Greenwich Palace sits on the south bank of the river, a sprawling complex of red brick and glass, its gardens beginning to green after winter, its tilt yard freshly raked for the jousting season that is about to begin. The court has been at Greenwich since Easter, and it will move again soon, following the seasonal rhythm that carries the king and his household from palace to palace throughout the year, partly for pleasure and partly because a residence occupied by over 1,000 people for too long begins to smell of exactly what you would expect. The atmosphere at court in the spring of 1536 is difficult to describe without sounding melodramatic, because the reality truly was as tense as any description makes it sound. England has spent 3 years living through a religious revolution. King Henry has broken from the Roman Catholic Church, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and married a woman for whom he annulled a 24-year marriage to a Spanish princess who was, by most accounts, beloved by large portions of the English population. That woman, Anne Boleyn, has been queen for 3 years. She has given the king one living child, a daughter, Elizabeth. She has not given him a son. And in January of this year, she miscarried a child that, according to several accounts, would have been male. 2 events from earlier in this same year cast especially long shadows over the court in April. The first is the death, on the 7th of January, of Catherine of Aragon, the king's first wife, who died at Kimbolton Castle after years of increasingly isolated exile from court life, having refused, to her final breath, to accept the annulment of her marriage or the diminished title of Dowager Princess that Henry's government insisted upon calling her. Catherine's death removes one obstacle from Anne's position, since, as long as Catherine lived, any move against Anne risked the appearance of restoring Catherine to her former place, a possibility Henry had no interest in entertaining. But Catherine's death also removes a kind of protective ambiguity. With Catherine gone, there is no longer a former queen for Anne to be measured against, no visible alternative that makes Anne's continued position seem, by comparison, secure. Anne herself, according to several accounts from ladies who served her at the time, reacted to news of Catherine's death with an unseemly display of relief and celebration, a reaction that struck many observers, even those sympathetic to Anne, as poorly judged given how precarious her own position had already become. The second event, occurring only 3 weeks later, on the 24th of January, is the king's own near-fatal jousting accident, in which his horse fell upon him during a tournament and he lay unconscious for a period that some accounts describe as lasting 2 hours. Henry survives, though the injury to his leg from this fall will trouble him for the remainder of his life, developing into the chronic, ulcerated wound that later observers would describe as a source of constant pain and, correspondingly, foul temper. But the accident itself, and the very real possibility that the king might have died in that tilt-yard, exposes with brutal clarity exactly how fragile the entire Tudor succession remains. Henry has, at this point, one living son, born to his sister's former lady-in-waiting, Bessie Blount, outside of marriage, and therefore ineligible to inherit the throne. He has 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom have been declared illegitimate at different points in the ongoing marital drama that has consumed his reign. He has no legitimate male heir. And on the 24th of January, England came within what might have been mere minutes of discovering exactly how catastrophic that absence could become. 5 days after this accident, on the 29th of January, the same day as Catherine of Aragon's funeral at Peterborough Cathedral, Anne Boleyn miscarries. The child, according to several sources close to the event, appeared to have been male, a detail that transforms an already devastating loss into something approaching a dynastic catastrophe. Contemporary accounts describe Henry's reaction to this miscarriage in terms that suggest the beginning of a decisive shift in his feelings toward his wife. Where he had once tolerated Anne's sharp tongue and independent temperament as part of what made her fascinating, he now begins, according to several courtiers' later testimony, to speak of having been seduced into the marriage. Language that carries unmistakable undertones of witchcraft accusation, however carefully Henry himself avoided using that specific word. It is into this atmosphere, charged with grief, disappointment, and a king's growing conviction that his marriage has been cursed rather than simply unlucky, that Jane Seymour enters the story with increasing prominence. Jane has served as one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting for some time, a quiet, unremarkable presence by most contemporary descriptions, notable chiefly for a demeanour that stood in deliberate, almost pointed contrast to Anne's famous wit and vivacity. By the early months of 1536, the king's attentions toward Jane have become impossible for the court to ignore, and Cecily herself has witnessed, on several occasions, small gifts and gestures passing between Henry and Jane that carry an unmistakable significance to anyone familiar with the choreography of royal courtship. This is the environment Cecily inhabits every day of April 1536. A court simultaneously mourning a former queen, nursing a king recovering from a nearly fatal accident, absorbing the loss of a hoped-for prince, and watching, with the close attentiveness that court survival demands, as the king's interest visibly shifts toward a woman who occupies, at this point, precisely the kind of quiet, unthreatening position that Anne herself once occupied before her own dramatic rise. The pattern, to anyone paying close attention, is not subtle. But recognizing the pattern and being able to do anything about it are two entirely different matters, and Cecily, like everyone else in Anne's household, possesses only the former. The political court that has formed around this marriage is not a unified body. It is a collection of competing factions, each anchored to different interests, different religious sympathies, different family alliances, and different assessments of where the wind is blowing. There are those loyal to the memory of Catherine of Aragon, the king's first wife, who died in January of this same year, alone at Kimbolton Castle, still insisting to her final breath that she was the king's only true wife. There are those aligned with the Boleyn family, who rose from modest gentry origins to the very centre of English power on the strength of Anne's marriage, and who now stand to lose everything if that marriage fails. There are religious reformers who see Anne as a champion of the new Protestant learning, and there are conservative Catholics who see her as a heretic who corrupted the king and destroyed the true church. And presiding over all of it, weaving between the factions with a patience and a ruthlessness that most of his contemporaries did not fully appreciate until it was too late, is Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, a man who began his career as the son of a blacksmith and has climbed, through sheer administrative brilliance and total absence of sentiment, to become the second most powerful person in England. Cromwell's relationship with Anne Boleyn has been, for most of her queenship, an alliance of convenience. They share reformist religious sympathies. They have worked together on matters of policy. But by the spring of 1536, that alliance has curdled into something closer to mutual danger. Anne has quarrelled with Cromwell over how to spend the wealth being seized from England's dissolved monasteries, wealth that Anne once directed toward charitable and educational purposes, and that Cromwell once funneled into the royal treasury. Anne has also, according to several accounts, made comments suggesting that if the king were to die, or if her position were threatened, she would see to it that Cromwell lost his head. Whether these comments were serious, or the kind of exaggerated threat that court factions traded constantly, Cromwell could not afford to treat them as idle. He understood, better than almost anyone in England, how quickly a queen's favour could turn into a queen's vengeance. The precise moment when Cromwell decided to move against Anne Boleyn is one of the great unresolved questions of Tudor history. What is not in dispute is that by April of 1536 he had begun quietly assembling the pieces of a case, and the case he was building would require testimony. It would require witnesses. It would require women who had been close enough to the Queen to have heard things, seen things, and who could be persuaded, through fear or ambition or genuine belief, to say what needed to be said. This is the world into which Our Lady-in-Waiting steps every morning when she rises before dawn to attend the Queen. It is time to meet her. Her name, for the purposes of tonight's story, is Cecily. She is a composite drawn from the real women who served Anne Boleyn's household in this period, women whose individual fates varied enormously, but whose collective experience tells us something true about what it meant to occupy this position at this exact moment in history. Cecily is 22 years old, the second daughter of a knight from Kent, His family has maintained a cautious, careful loyalty to the crown through several decades of shifting political fortune. She was placed in the Queen's household 2 years ago at the age of 20 through the intervention of a cousin already established at court and the payment of a sum of money that her father described, in a letter Cecily still keeps, as an investment in the family's future. This is worth understanding clearly because it is one of the details that modern audiences most consistently misunderstand. A position as lady-in-waiting to the Queen of England was not a job in the way we understand employment today. It was not something a woman applied for based on personal ambition or individual talent, though talent and charm certainly helped. It was a strategic placement, negotiated by families, understood as a long-term investment in influence and marriage prospects and royal favour. Cecily did not choose this position any more than a modern person chooses which family they are born into. Her father chose it for her, calculating, with the cold arithmetic that governed aristocratic family strategy, that a daughter placed in the Queen's innermost circle was worth more to the family's future than a daughter married off quietly to a neighbouring gentleman with no connection to the court at all. Cecily's preparation for this role began years before she ever set foot in a royal palace. Her mother, herself a woman who had briefly served in a noble household as a girl, oversaw an education designed with a single purpose in mind. Cecily learned to read and write in English, a skill by no means universal even among gentry daughters, and she learned enough French to follow conversation and correspondence, since French remained in the 1530s the language most associated with courtly sophistication, a legacy of centuries of cultural exchange between the English and French aristocracies. She learned to dance the intricate court dances that would be expected of her at every banquet and masque. She learned needlework to a standard far beyond simple practicality, since a lady's embroidery was understood as a visible marker of patience, refinement, and family investment. She learned to play, adequately if not brilliantly, upon the lute, because musical accomplishment was expected of any woman moving in circles where music formed a constant backdrop to daily life. Beyond these formal accomplishments, Cecily absorbed something harder to name and harder to teach directly. A set of instincts about deportment, about when to speak and when to remain silent, about how to modulate her expression in the presence of people whose favour could elevate or destroy her family's fortunes. Surviving letters from Tudor gentry families preparing daughters for court service offer a window into exactly this kind of instruction. One mother of the period, writing to advise a friend whose daughter was about to enter royal service, described the essential qualities required as sobriety, wisdom, discretion, and a humility that expressed itself in careful attention to one's tongue. Cecily's mother offered similar counsel in the weeks before her daughter's departure, counsel that Cecily initially received as fairly abstract moral instruction, and that she would, within her first year at court, come to understand as something closer to a survival manual. The financial calculations underlying Cecily's placement deserve attention as well, because they illuminate just how seriously aristocratic families took this investment. Placing a daughter in a queen's household required money, sometimes considerable money, to outfit her appropriately, to provide gifts that demonstrated the family's own standing, to sustain the ongoing expenses that court life imposed on even its more modest participants. Cecily's father, a knight of respectable but not extravagant means, had drawn on family resources that might otherwise have gone toward improving the family estate or securing a more conventional dowry, gambling instead on the possibility that royal service would yield returns far exceeding this initial outlay. A well-placed daughter might attract a marriage proposal from a family of considerably higher standing than would otherwise have been available. She might secure royal patronage for her brothers. She might, simply through her presence in the Queen's confidence, provide the family with information and influence unavailable through any other channel. The position itself is a strange combination of glamour and confinement. Cecily wears gowns that would have been unthinkable for a woman of her family's modest means before her placement at court. Fabrics and furs supplied partly by her own family's stretched resources and partly by the Queen's household, because a lady-in-waiting who dressed poorly reflected badly on the Queen she served. She attends masques and banquets. She has danced in the presence of foreign ambassadors. She has watched the king joust in the tilt-yard at Greenwich, cheering with the other ladies as he rode past their gallery, his armour gleaming, his horse's hooves throwing up clods of turf. But the glamour exists inside a cage of proximity that most people, looking at the portraits and the velvet gowns, do not fully appreciate. Cecily sleeps in the Queen's bedchamber several nights a week, on a pallet bed set near the foot of Anne's own bed, ready to rise instantly if the Queen requires anything during the night. She helps dress the Queen every morning, which means she sees Anne Boleyn's body in a state of complete undress, sees the marks and blemishes and physical realities that the court portraits and the careful public presentation are designed to hide. She hears the Queen's private conversations with her other ladies. She has, on more than one occasion, been present in the room during arguments between Anne and the King, arguments that Cecily was required to witness with her eyes cast down and her face arranged into an expression of careful, practiced blankness. This is the first great lesson of survival at the Tudor court, and it is one that every lady-in-waiting learns within her first weeks of service, usually taught not through explicit instruction, but through the sharp correction of an older, more experienced woman who has seen what happens to those who fail to learn it quickly enough. You are present in the room, but you are not, in any meaningful sense, allowed to have witnessed anything. Your eyes see everything. Your face must show nothing, and your mouth, outside the room, must repeat none of it to anyone under any circumstances. Because the walls of the Tudor court have ears in every sense that phrase can carry, and a careless word repeated to the wrong person can travel from a private bedchamber to the king's own council table within a single afternoon. The royal apartments themselves are a study in claustrophobic intimacy. Contrary to the popular image of vast, echoing palace halls where privacy is impossible simply because the spaces are too large, the private chambers of a Tudor queen are, in fact, quite small and quite crowded. The Queen's bedchamber at Greenwich is perhaps 20 feet across. It contains the great bed itself, hung with rich curtains that can be drawn for a small measure of privacy, but do nothing to block sound. It contains several pallet beds for the ladies who sleep in rotation near the Queen. It contains chests for clothing, a small altar for private devotion, chairs, a table. 6 to 8 women occupy this space at any given time, along with the Queen herself, and the physical closeness is total. You can hear another woman's breathing across the room. You can hear her turn over in her sleep. You can hear, with painful clarity, every word spoken above a whisper. This closeness extends beyond the bedchamber into every aspect of court life. The privy chamber, where the Queen receives visitors and conducts the more relaxed business of her day, is similarly intimate. The presence chamber, larger and more formal, still places ladies in waiting within easy earshot of conversations they are technically not meant to be part of. There is, in the entire architecture of royal life, almost no space in which genuine privacy exists. Even the King and Queen's most intimate moments together occur within a household structure designed around the assumption that servants and attendants will be present, or nearby, or listening through a door that is never quite as solid as anyone would like. Cecily understood this arrangement as simply the nature of her position when she first arrived at court. It did not initially strike her as sinister. It struck her, if anything, as flattering. To be close enough to the Queen to hear her private thoughts was a mark of trust, a sign that Cecily had been accepted into the innermost circle of the most powerful woman in England. It took her many months to understand that proximity to power in the Tudor court was not simply an intimacy. It was, in an environment as politically volatile as this one, a form of exposure. And by the spring of 1536, that exposure had become dangerous in a way that Cecily, along with most of the other women in the Queen's household, had not yet allowed herself to fully recognize. We should step inside the Queen's privy chamber on an ordinary afternoon in April and watch, through Cecily's eyes, exactly how dangerous ordinary had become. Cecily's days follow a structure that has become, after 2 years, entirely automatic. She rises before the Queen, usually around 6 in the morning, and prepares herself before attending to Anne's dressing. The dressing itself is a lengthy, collaborative process involving several ladies working in careful sequence. The undergarments first, then the kirtle, then the elaborate outer gown with its wide sleeves and jewelled bodice, then the hood, which, for Anne Boleyn, means the French style she favours, a rounded shape that shows more of her dark hair than the more conservative English gable hood that her predecessor, Catherine of Aragon, preferred, and that Jane Seymour, one of the Queen's own ladies, has recently taken to wearing herself. A small, sartorial detail that several of the more observant women in the household have noted with quiet unease. Cecily's specific responsibilities include managing the Queen's jewellery box, a task that requires meticulous care given the value of what it contains, and assisting with the Queen's correspondence, since Cecily's education included enough Latin and French to make her useful for copying letters and managing the small library of devotional texts and French romances that Anne keeps in her private rooms. This last responsibility has placed Cecily in a position of special trust. She has read letters that were never meant for her eyes. She has transcribed passages from books that reflect the Queen's genuine religious convictions. Convictions that put Anne on the reformist, evangelical side of a religious divide that many at court, including some very powerful people, considered dangerously close to heresy. Anne's household, more broadly, reflects her own genuine interest in the new religious learning that was sweeping through parts of continental Europe and finding increasing purchase among educated English readers. She patronizes scholars and reformist clergy. She keeps English translations of scripture within easy reach, a practice that carries real theological weight in an era when the Church had historically insisted that the Bible be encountered only in Latin, filtered through priestly interpretation rather than read directly by ordinary believers in their own tongue. Cecily, tasked with organizing this small library, has absorbed more of this reformist thinking than she probably realizes, simply through the accumulated hours of handling these texts, reading passages aloud when the Queen requests it, becoming familiar with arguments and interpretations that a woman of her more conventional upbringing would otherwise never have encountered. This religious dimension of Anne's household matters enormously for understanding the political undercurrents swirling around the Queen in these final months, though it operates mostly beneath the surface of Cecily's daily awareness. The conservative faction at court, anchored by figures who remained loyal to the older Catholic order even after Henry's formal break with Rome, viewed Anne's religious sympathies with genuine alarm, seeing in her patronage of reformist scholars and her personal reading habits evidence of a queen who might push the kingdom's religious transformation further than even the king himself desired. This suspicion, layered atop the more immediate political and dynastic concerns driving Cromwell's investigation, adds yet another dimension to the coalition of interests that ultimately aligned against Anne Boleyn in the spring of 1536. Beyond her official duties, Cecily's days are filled with the countless small tasks and social performances that constitute court life. She attends the Queen at meals, standing nearby with a napkin and a cup, ready to serve. She accompanies her on walks through the palace gardens when the weather permits. She sits with the other ladies in the afternoons, sewing, playing cards, listening to music, engaging in the elaborate verbal games of wit and flirtation that the court calls collectively courtly love. The rhythm of an ordinary day, when nothing extraordinary is occurring, has a texture worth pausing over. Because it is this ordinary rhythm, this accumulated weight of thousands of unremarkable hours, that makes the sudden violence of May so disorienting when it finally arrives. Mornings begin early and move through a sequence that has become, for Cecily, entirely automatic. Attendance at the Queen's rising and dressing, a period of religious observance, since Anne, whatever the eventual charges against her religious sincerity, maintains a household of genuine and visible piety, with daily prayers and regular attendance at chapel that every lady in her service is expected to share. Breakfast, a relatively modest meal by the standards of the grander feasts that punctuate court life, taken informally within the privy chamber. The middle portion of the day varies according to the season and the Queen's own inclinations. In fine weather, there are walks through the palace gardens, formal spaces laid out in the geometric patterns that Tudor garden design favoured, box hedges trimmed into elaborate knots, gravel paths raked smooth each morning by an army of gardeners whose labour no courtier ever thinks to notice. There is hawking, on occasion, when the Queen wishes to ride out with a small party to fly falcons over the open fields beyond the palace grounds, an activity Cecily has grown to genuinely enjoy despite the physical discomfort of long hours in the saddle, since it offers one of the only opportunities for anything resembling open space and fresh air within the otherwise relentlessly interior existence of court service. Afternoons, especially in poor weather, settle into the more sedentary rhythms of needlework, reading aloud, card games, and conversation. The last of which brings us back to the elaborate verbal architecture of courtly love that structured so much of daily interaction between the Queen's ladies and the gentlemen of the court. This deserves careful explanation, because it is impossible to understand what happened to Anne Boleyn without understanding the social game that provided the raw material for the accusations against her. Now, here is where most people get this wrong, and it matters enormously for understanding what happened next. Courtly love was not, in its original and intended form, a euphemism for actual sexual conduct. It was a highly codified, almost theatrical social game, inherited from medieval French and Italian literary traditions, in which male courtiers were expected to profess elaborate, poetic devotion to noble ladies, often married ladies, often ladies far above their own social station, or explicitly unavailable to them. A knight might write sonnets to a duchess he had no realistic hope of ever touching. A courtier might spend years performing devoted service to a lady as a kind of aesthetic and social exercise, demonstrating his refinement, his wit, his mastery of a language and a set of gestures that separated the truly cultured from the merely wealthy. The literary tradition underlying this game drew heavily on continental sources, especially the sonnet forms popularized by the Italian poet Petrarch, whose influence had spread through the French court and, by the 1530s, had found eager English imitators in poets like Thomas Wyatt, a man whose own youthful infatuation with Anne Boleyn, expressed in verse that scholars still study today, would later come back to haunt him, when he too found himself imprisoned during the investigation into her conduct. These poems traded in a specific emotional vocabulary: unrequited longing, noble suffering, the beloved's cruelty, and the lover's endless patience, that everyone at court understood as performance rather than confession. A man might write of dying for love of a lady he had scarcely spoken to in private, and everyone who heard the poem recited would understand it as an exercise in wit and craft, not as a literal statement of intent. Cecily herself has participated in this game countless times over her 2 years at court, though always, given her more modest rank, at its periphery rather than its centre. She has been the recipient of courtly compliments from young gentlemen practicing their conversational skills. She has exchanged the kind of teasing banter that the game requires, careful always to maintain the proper boundary between performance and impropriety, a boundary that every experienced courtier learns to navigate almost without conscious thought. Anne Boleyn was, by every account, extraordinarily skilled at this game. She had learned it in the French court as a young woman, absorbing the sophisticated conversational style, the wit, the flirtatious banter that French court culture prized, and that English court culture, somewhat more provincial by comparison, found both thrilling and faintly scandalous. As Queen, Anne continued to play this game with the men of her household, exchanging teasing compliments, accepting extravagant professions of devotion, engaging in a kind of verbal sparring that was, within the rules everyone understood, entirely proper. The danger, which Cecily and every other woman in the Queen's household would come to understand with terrible clarity, was that the rules of courtly love existed only as long as everyone agreed to interpret them charitably. The same words, the same gestures, the same playful exchanges that had been performed at court for years without incident could, if someone chose to reinterpret them, be read as evidence of something far more damning. A poem professing devotion could become evidence of an affair, A joke about waiting for a lady's hand could become evidence of a plot to hasten a husband's death. And in the spring of 1536, someone with enormous power had decided, for reasons that remain debated among historians to this day, to begin reinterpreting exactly these kinds of exchanges. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely. The women who served Anne Boleyn were not living inside a scandal waiting to happen. They were living inside an entirely conventional courtly environment, one whose rules had been stable and understood for years. And that environment was about to be weaponized against them by men who understood those same rules well enough to twist them beyond recognition. Cecily does not yet know this on the afternoon we are watching her. She sits with the other ladies in the Queen's privy chamber, her needle moving through a piece of embroidery, half listening to Anne's conversation with several of the gentlemen who have come to pay their respects. Sir Henry Norris is there, a quiet, well-liked man who serves as the King's groom of the stool, a position of remarkable intimacy with the King's person that also makes Norris one of the most influential men at court, since he controls, quite literally, who gains access to the King's private chambers. Norris is a widower, and it is known at court that he has been courting Margaret Shelton, one of Anne's own cousins and fellow ladies-in-waiting, though the courtship has proceeded slowly, in the leisurely fashion that aristocratic marriage negotiations typically require. Anne, in a moment of teasing that Cecily has witnessed perhaps a dozen times in different forms over the past 2 years, asks Norris why he has not yet married her cousin. It is the kind of question a queen might ask a favoured courtier, half genuine curiosity and half performance, an opportunity for Norris to offer some clever, self-deprecating response about the perils of marriage or the slow pace of love. Norris, in the moment Cecily witnesses, gives an answer along these lines, something about being content to wait a while longer. And Anne, quick-witted as always, unable to resist the kind of sharp, teasing remark that has made her both beloved at court in equal measure, replies with words that Cecily will remember for the rest of her life, though she does not yet understand, in this moment, just how much those words are going to matter. Anne tells Norris that he looks for dead men's shoes, that if anything but good should happen to the King, Norris would look to have her himself. The room goes quiet for perhaps half a second. It is the kind of remark that, spoken among friends in private, might have drawn a laugh, or a mock scandalized gasp, or simply a raised eyebrow and a change of subject. It is dangerous, technically, because to speak of the King's death, even in jest, edges toward treason under English law. But everyone in the room has heard Anne make remarks like this before. She has a sharp tongue. She says things that a more cautious woman would never say aloud, and she has for years gotten away with it precisely because the people around her have understood the difference between a queen's careless wit and an actual threat. Norris, to his credit, understands immediately how the remark could be misconstrued, and he responds with visible alarm, saying that if he entertained any such thought, he would wish his own head cut off. It is a performance of loyalty, delivered quickly and with evident sincerity, the kind of correction that court etiquette demands when a joke has ventured too close to dangerous territory. The conversation moves on. The moment passes. Cecily, sitting nearby with her embroidery, thinks nothing more of it. It is simply another afternoon, another exchange of the quick, dangerous wit that characterizes life around this queen. She has heard remarks like this before. She will hear remarks like this again, she assumes, for years to come, because Anne Boleyn is not a woman who edits herself for the comfort of others, and this has always been, until now, simply a fact of serving her. Cecily does not know that this exact exchange, repeated by someone in the room, or overheard through a door, or reported second-hand by someone who was not even present, will become one of the central pieces of evidence in a case that ends with 2 people dead. She does not know that within 2 weeks she will be asked, under conditions of considerable pressure, to recount this conversation in precise detail to men whose only interest is in fitting her memory into a narrative they have already decided is true. She does not know, in other words, that she is living inside the last few weeks of a world that is about to end. Let us stop here for a moment and talk about the machinery that was already invisibly working against her, because it is woven through everything we are about to watch. By April of 1536, Thomas Cromwell had spent years building one of the most effective intelligence networks in English history. Though the word intelligence, with its modern connotations of formal state espionage, does not quite capture how this system actually worked. Cromwell did not employ professional spies in the way a modern intelligence agency might. He cultivated relationships. He identified people with grievances, ambitions, debts, or vulnerabilities, and he made himself useful to them in exchange for information. And within the Queen's own household, several of the women closest to Anne Boleyn had, by this point, developed exactly the kind of relationship with Cromwell that made them valuable sources. Cromwell's method, as reconstructed by historians from the surviving correspondence and administrative records of his ministry, relied less on dramatic coercion than on patient cultivation. He understood, better than any other figure in Henry's government, that people rarely need to be threatened outright when their own circumstances already supply sufficient motivation to cooperate. A woman whose husband owed money, a family hoping for a wardship or a grant of land, a courtier nursing a grievance against a rival within the Queen's own faction. Cromwell kept mental ledgers, and in some cases literal ones, of exactly these kinds of vulnerabilities, and he drew upon them with a patience that most of his contemporaries, focused on more immediate forms of political maneuvering, simply did not match. The most documented case involves a woman named Margaret Coffin, wife of Anne's Master of the Horse, who slept on a pallet bed in the Queen's own bedchamber. Margaret was, by the account of the constable of the Tower who later oversaw Anne's imprisonment, extraordinarily useful in reporting the Queen's private words and behaviour. This is not speculation. It survives in the written record. The constable, a man named William Kingston, wrote to Cromwell that he had, in his own words, everything told to him by Mistress Coffin that she thought fit for him to know. Margaret may also have been passing information through some intermediary to Eustace Chapuis, the ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire, whose dispatches back to his own government contained details about Anne's private religious statements that could only have come from someone with intimate access to the Queen's most guarded moments. Consider the psychological weight of this situation for a woman like Cecily, and for the other ladies who did not know, could not know, which of their companions might already be reporting private conversations to powerful men outside the room. This is not a hypothetical anxiety we are projecting backward onto history. It is the actual, documented reality of Anne Boleyn's household in this period. The women who slept beside each other, who dressed each other, who shared confidences in the close intimacy that female households cultivate, existed inside a structure where at least some of them were, whether through coercion, ambition, or genuine political conviction, transmitting private information to men who intended to use it. The walls, quite literally, had ears in ways that went beyond metaphor. Palace construction in this period involved thin partition walls, gaps beneath doors, and servants' passages that ran close enough to private chambers that a person standing quietly in the right spot could hear conversations meant to be private. Household accounts from various Tudor palaces record payments to servants for tasks that, on closer examination, appear to have involved exactly this kind of positioned listening. A groom paid to wait near a specific door at a specific hour. A page instructed to linger in a specific gallery. None of this required elaborate espionage tradecraft. It required only the ordinary architecture of a crowded palace and the willingness of ordinary people, servants and courtiers alike, to make themselves useful to whoever held power. This created, for every woman in Anne Boleyn's service, an impossible calculation that had no good solution. If you heard the Queen say something dangerous, something that could be construed as treasonous even if it was clearly meant in jest, you faced two equally perilous options. You could say nothing and hope that no one else in the room repeated it, knowing that if the remark did surface later and it came out that you had heard it and stayed silent, you yourself could be charged with misprison the legal term for concealing knowledge of treason, a crime that carried its own severe penalties. Or you could report what you heard, protecting yourself but betraying a woman you had served, in many cases, for years. A woman whose fall would inevitably drag down not only herself, but everyone associated with her, quite possibly including the very people who had tried to protect themselves by reporting on her. There was no safe position. This is the detail that most retellings of the Anne Boleyn story flatten into a simple narrative of villains and victims, when the actual human experience of the women in that household was one of continuous, grinding, impossible calculation, performed daily with no reliable information about who around them could be trusted and who could not. The feminist dimension of this reality deserves close attention, because it is easy, looking back from a modern vantage point, to judge the women who reported on Anne Boleyn as betrayers, and to judge the women who said nothing as either brave or foolish, without fully appreciating how little genuine agency any of them possessed. These were women placed in the Queen's household by their fathers, husbands, and male relatives for the specific purpose of advancing family interests. Their marriages had been, in most cases, arranged for political and financial advantage rather than personal choice. Their presence at court was itself a form of family investment, and their behavior while there reflected not merely on themselves, but on entire kinship networks that depended on royal favor for their continued prosperity. When Cromwell's investigation began to accelerate, the pressure applied to these women did not come only from Cromwell himself. It came, in many documented cases, from their own families, who understood exactly how dangerous proximity to a falling queen could become, and who had every incentive to encourage cooperation with the men conducting the investigation, regardless of what that cooperation might cost the Queen herself. A father whose daughter served Anne Boleyn was not, in the spring of 1536, primarily concerned with protecting the Queen's reputation. He was concerned with protecting his family's survival. And if that meant his daughter needed to answer Cromwell's questions honestly, or even needed to shade her answers in a specific direction, most families would have considered that a reasonable price to pay. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it complicates any simple moral accounting of who behaved well and who behaved badly during Anne Boleyn's fall. Almost every person involved, from the most minor lady-in-waiting to the most powerful courtier, was operating inside a system of coercion so total that individual choice becomes difficult to isolate from structural necessity. These were not free agents making villainous or heroic decisions in a vacuum. They were people, mostly women, embedded in family networks and political structures that made genuine independence of action nearly impossible, facing a man in Thomas Cromwell who understood precisely how to exploit every one of those pressures. Cecily herself does not fully grasp any of this yet, on the April afternoon we have been watching. She understands, in the way that any experienced courtier understands, that discretion is valuable and that gossip can be dangerous. But she has not yet been forced to confront the full weight of what her position actually requires of her. That confrontation is coming. It is coming within days. There is more to understand here before we move forward, and it concerns not the mechanics of surveillance, but the deeper anxiety that had been building beneath the surface of court life for months. We should return to the narrative timeline and watch as the pressure that has been quietly accumulating finally, catastrophically, breaks. The final week of April moves with an odd, uneven rhythm. Cecily notices, without fully understanding why, that certain gentlemen of the court have begun to look strained. Mark Smeaton, a young musician of humble birth who has enjoyed unusual favour in the Queen's household, appears withdrawn and melancholic in a way that draws comment among the ladies, though no one can quite say why. There are rumours, the kind that circulate through a court like this constantly and rarely amount to anything, that Cromwell has taken an interest in some matter concerning the Queen's household, though no one Cecily speaks with can say precisely what. On the last Saturday of April, Cecily witnesses from across the room a brief and seemingly unremarkable exchange between the Queen and Sir Henry Norris, essentially a continuation of the same teasing conversation about his courtship of Margaret Shelton that has played out between them many times before. She thinks nothing of it. It is simply another Saturday. She does not know, cannot know, that Mark Smeaton has already been quietly summoned to Cromwell's own house, not to the more formal setting of a royal interrogation, but to a private residence, where whatever occurred, whether through intimidation, promise, or something closer to physical coercion, resulted in the young musician confessing to an adulterous relationship with the Queen. This confession, however it was obtained, and whatever its actual truth, becomes the foundation stone of everything that follows. May Day arrives with the court's usual seasonal festivities, a jousting tournament at Greenwich, in which Henry Norris rides among the competitors, and the Queen watches from her gallery, seated beside the King in what should be, and appears to every observer to be, an entirely ordinary display of royal pageantry. Cecily attends the Queen that morning, helping her dress in her finest gown for the occasion, and there is nothing in Anne's demeanour, nothing at all, that suggests she has any premonition of what the day will bring. Partway through the tournament, something shifts. Cecily, standing near the Queen's gallery, notices the King rise abruptly from his seat and depart with only a small group of attendants, offering no explanation, breaking with an abruptness that violates every convention of royal decorum. The tournament continues without him, awkwardly, the competitors and spectators exchanging uncertain glances, unsure whether to proceed as though nothing unusual has happened, or to wonder aloud what has caused the King's sudden departure. Cecily learns only later, through the fragmented, panicked information that begins circulating through the household over the following hours, that Henry Norris was called away with the King, that the King questioned him directly on the ride back toward London about whether he had committed adultery with the Queen, offering him a pardon in exchange for confession. Norris, according to every account that survives, denied everything and refused to confess to a crime he insisted he had not committed. By the following morning, the 2nd of May, the machinery that has been quietly assembling for weeks finally, publicly engages. Anne Boleyn is summoned before a group of the King's councillors and informed of the charges against her. She is accused of adultery with multiple men, including Mark Smeaton, whose confession is cited as evidence, and including Henry Norris, whose conversation with the Queen about dead men's shoes, the very exchange Cecily witnessed weeks earlier, is presented as evidence of a plot to hasten the King's death so that Anne might marry Norris afterward. Cecily is not present for this confrontation. She learns of it the way most of the Queen's household learns of it, through a wave of frightened whispers that moves through the palace with the terrible speed of genuinely catastrophic news. The Queen has been accused. The Queen is being questioned. The Queen's own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, has already been taken to the Tower, arrested hours before his sister even learned what was happening, on charges of incest. The accusation being that he too has committed adultery with the Queen, his own sister. An allegation so extreme that even hardened courtiers accustomed to the brutal machinery of Tudor politics find themselves struggling to process it. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Anne Boleyn is taken by barge to the Tower of London. Cecily does not accompany her. Almost none of the Queen's usual household does. This is one of the cruelest and least understood aspects of what happens next. The women who have spent years in close, intimate service to Anne Boleyn are, in the immediate aftermath of her arrest, systematically separated from her. New attendants are assigned, women selected specifically by Cromwell and the Constable of the Tower. Women chosen not for their loyalty to Anne but for their willingness, or their proven capacity, to report everything she says and does. Cecily spends that first night in a state of genuine terror that she will remember for the rest of her life, though the terror is not, in this moment, primarily about Anne's fate. It is about her own. She does not know whether she herself will be summoned for questioning. She does not know whether something she witnessed, something she failed to report, something she said in passing to another lady of the household might now be twisted into evidence against her. She lies awake in the shared chamber where she and several of the other displaced ladies have been temporarily housed, listening to the muffled sound of at least one woman, weeping in the darkness. And she understands, with a clarity that arrives all at once, that the world she has occupied for the past 2 years, the world of embroidery and courtly wit and careful, practiced discretion, has ended, and that whatever replaces it will be far more dangerous than anything she has yet experienced. The panic that spreads through the court in the days immediately following the 2nd of May is not exaggerated by hindsight. Contemporary accounts describe a genuine, palpable atmosphere of terror gripping anyone who had any connection to the Queen's household. Sir Francis Weston, a young courtier known for his charm and his closeness to Anne's circle, is arrested 2 days after the initial charges, accused on similarly flimsy grounds. Sir William Brereton, a groom of the King's Privy Chamber, follows soon after. Sir Thomas Wyatt, the poet whose youthful infatuation with Anne before her marriage to the King was well known at court, is also imprisoned, though he will eventually be released, likely owing to his family's friendship with Cromwell himself, a detail that illustrates with brutal clarity just how much of this process depended not on evidence, but on the personal calculations of one enormously powerful man. For Cecily and the other women who remain, unaccused but deeply frightened, the following days bring a series of interrogations that, while less dramatic than an arrest, carry their own distinct terror. Let us stop here for a moment and talk about how these interrogations actually worked, because it is a subject that popular imagination tends to get wrong in a very specific way. Thomas Cromwell did not need to torture noblewomen to extract the testimony he required. This is not because he was squeamish about brutality, a claim that his broader career as the architect of the monastic dissolutions and the enforcer of the king's will thoroughly disproves. It is because physical torture was, in this instance, entirely unnecessary. The women of Anne Boleyn's household were vulnerable to a form of pressure that required no rack, no thumbscrews, no physical violence of any kind, because their entire existence was structured around forms of security that could be destroyed with nothing more than a well-placed accusation and the mere suggestion of continued royal displeasure. Consider what a noblewoman in Cecily's position actually possessed and what she stood to lose: her social standing, her marriage prospects, or, if already married, her husband's continued favour and position, her family's broader standing at court, which depended enormously on avoiding any association with disgrace or treason, her physical safety, not from immediate violence, but from the much slower, equally devastating violence of social and financial ruin, of a family stripped of land and title and position, of a woman rendered unmarriageable and her younger sisters along with her, of an entire kinship network cast into the kind of poverty and irrelevance from which Tudor families rarely recovered. Against this backdrop, the mere suggestion that a woman's testimony was needed, that her cooperation would be remembered favorably, that her silence or evasion might itself become suspicious, was more than sufficient to produce exactly the statements Cromwell required. He did not need to threaten Cecily, or any woman like her, with physical harm. He needed only to remind her, implicitly or explicitly, of everything she had to lose, and to make clear that continued royal favour for herself and her family depended on her willingness to remember events in a specific light. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely, because it reframes what happened to these women not as a story of dramatic torture and forced confession, but as something quieter and, in some ways, more insidious. A story of ordinary social and economic coercion applied with surgical precision against women who had no independent power base from which to resist it. The threat of the executioner's block was real for some of the accused, but for the women who were merely questioned, the more immediate and pervasive threat was social annihilation, a fate that Tudor aristocratic culture, with its rigid dependence on reputation and family standing, treated as its own kind of death sentence. And here we arrive at one of the most painful and most misunderstood figures in this entire story. Jane Boleyn, known to history as Lady Rochford, wife of George Boleyn and therefore sister-in-law to the Queen herself. Jane's marriage to George Boleyn had, by most accounts, been troubled for years. The couple had no children after roughly a decade of marriage, and various sources from the period suggest a relationship marked by distance, if not outright unhappiness. When the investigation into Anne and George accelerated, Jane found herself in a position of almost unbearable precarity. She was married to a man now accused of incest with his own sister. If George was found guilty, and increasingly it seemed a matter of when rather than if, Jane stood to lose her husband, her position, her income, and quite possibly her own liberty, depending on how deeply the investigation chose to implicate her. The traditional historical account, repeated in countless books and dramatizations, holds that Jane, motivated by jealousy of the close relationship between George and Anne, or by simple malice, provided Cromwell with testimony that helped condemn her own husband and sister-in-law. Some versions of this story claim she reported intimate remarks about the king's sexual inadequacy, remarks that Anne had allegedly made to her in confidence, remarks that, once repeated to the right ears, became a devastating insult to a king already primed to believe the worst about his wife. Modern historians have grown considerably more cautious about this narrative, and it is worth pausing on why, because it illustrates something important about how history gets simplified into story. The surviving evidence for Jane's specific testimony is thin and comes largely from sources written years after the events, sources with their own agendas and their own distance from what actually occurred inside those interrogation rooms. What we know with more confidence is that Jane was questioned. We know that she survived the fall of her husband and sister-in-law, remaining at court in reduced but not destroyed circumstances. We know that years later, she would herself be executed in 1542 for her role in facilitating an affair between another of Henry's queens, Catherine Howard, and a courtier. A conviction that speaks to a woman who spent the remainder of her life navigating the same treacherous currents that had claimed her husband, and who ultimately drowned in them herself. Whatever the precise truth of Jane's testimony in 1536, her situation illustrates with painful clarity the impossible position that every woman connected to the Boleyn family occupied in these weeks. If she said nothing, and her husband was condemned regardless, as he almost certainly would have been given the political momentum already in motion, she would be left with nothing, having offered no cooperation to the men who now controlled her fate. If she spoke, and her words contributed to her husband's condemnation, she would carry that weight for the rest of her life, whether or not what she said was even substantially true, whether or not it made any real difference to an outcome that Cromwell had likely already determined before a single interrogation began. This is the darkest truth buried inside this entire episode, one that Cecily, watching from the periphery, begins to understand with growing horror as the days pass. The truth of what anyone actually said or did mattered less than most people assume. Cromwell was not building a case in the way a modern investigator builds a case, searching for facts and allowing those facts to determine a conclusion. He had already arrived at his conclusion. What he needed was testimony, any plausible testimony that could be arranged to support it. A remark about dead men's shoes spoken in jest weeks earlier, a comment about the king's sexual performance, whether real or exaggerated or entirely invented under pressure. A confession extracted from a frightened young musician who may have said whatever he believed his interrogators wanted to hear. None of these fragments needed to be true in any complete sense. They needed only to be plausible enough, when assembled together, to justify a conclusion that had already been reached. For Cecily, called before a small group of the king's councillors in the second week of May, this realization arrives with the force of genuine dread. She is asked, in a private chamber, by men whose names she recognizes as belonging to the king's innermost circle, to recount everything she remembers of the Queen's conversations over the preceding months. She is asked specifically about the exchange between Anne and Henry Norris regarding dead men's shoes. She is asked whether she witnessed any improper closeness between the Queen and any of the accused men. She is asked, repeatedly, in slightly varied forms, questions designed less to elicit new information than to confirm details that her interrogators already believe or claim to believe they know. The room itself, though Cecily has passed through similar chambers 100 times in her 2 years at court, feels entirely transformed by the purpose it now serves. A modest space, wood-panelled, with a single window admitting grey afternoon light, a table at which 3 men sit, papers arranged before them with the kind of bureaucratic neatness that Cromwell's administrative reforms have brought to every aspect of royal government. There is no dramatic apparatus of intimidation on display, no visible instruments of coercion, nothing that a modern imagination, primed by centuries of dramatized Inquisition scenes, might expect. The men speak calmly. They take notes. One of them, whose face Cecily does not recognize, but whose bearing suggests considerable authority, asks his questions in a tone that might, in any other context, be mistaken for simple courtesy. This calmness is, in its own way, more unsettling than open hostility would have been. Cecily finds herself grasping for the appropriate register of response, uncertain whether these men wish to be seen as her allies, gently helping her recall details she might otherwise forget, or as adversaries, testing the consistency of her account against information they already possess from other sources. She does not know, cannot know, what the other women of the household have already told these same men, whether her account of the dead men's shoes conversation matches or contradicts what has already been recorded, whether any inconsistency between her memory and someone else's might itself be read as evidence of concealment. She thinks, in the moments before she speaks, of her father, of the letter describing her placement at court as an investment in the family's future, of her younger sisters, whose own marriage prospects depend, in some diffuse but very real sense, on the Cecily family name remaining untainted by association with treason. She thinks of her mother's careful instruction delivered years earlier about discretion and sobriety and the careful management of one's tongue, instruction that never anticipated a scenario quite like this one, where discretion itself has become a kind of trap, where the very silence that court etiquette demanded of her for 2 years is now being interpreted by the men across this table as potential evidence of complicity. Cecily understands, sitting in that chamber, that she has arrived at exactly the impossible position we described earlier. If she minimizes what she witnessed, if she claims to remember nothing improper, she risks being seen as either lying to protect a traitor, or, worse, as having concealed knowledge of treason herself, a crime with its own severe penalties. If she confirms the details her interrogators seem to want confirmed, details that in her own memory were nothing more than the same teasing, flirtatious banter that has characterized this court for years, she becomes complicit in building a case against a woman she has served, in most respects loyally, for 2 years. She chooses, in the end, a path that many of the women in her position appear to have chosen, based on the surviving fragments of testimony that historians have pieced together from this period. She confirms the basic facts of what she witnessed, the words that were actually spoken, while offering, wherever she can, context that suggests innocence rather than guilt. She describes the exchange about dead men's shoes as she remembers it, including Norris's immediate, alarmed correction, his insistence that he intended no such treasonous thought. She does not embellish. She does not invent. But she also does not have the power to control how her testimony, however carefully offered, will ultimately be used by men who have already decided what story they intend to tell. This is, perhaps, the truest and most tragic thing that can be said about the women who found themselves questioned during this period. Most of them tried, within an impossibly narrow margin of safety, to tell some version of the truth while protecting both themselves and, where possible, the people they had served. And it did not matter. The machine that Cromwell had built did not require their complicity in a lie. It required only their honest testimony about events that could be reframed, reinterpreted, and reassembled into whatever shape the prosecution needed. Cecily returns from her interrogation, shaking, uncertain whether she has just condemned herself, condemn the Queen, or accomplish nothing at all, beyond confirming what everyone already believed was true. She spends the following days in a state of suspended dread that she will later describe to the very few people she ever speaks with about this period as worse, in some ways, than the fear she felt during the interrogation itself. There is nothing to do but wait, and attend to whatever minor duties remain available to a lady whose household has effectively dissolved around her, and listen, always listen, for any sign of what is coming next. She sleeps poorly, she eats little. She catches herself, on several occasions, replaying the interrogation in her mind, testing her own answers against every possible interpretation, wondering whether some phrase she chose, some detail she included or omitted, might yet prove to have been the wrong choice. She will not know for several more days which of these outcomes has actually occurred. And then, when the answer finally arrives, it will bring with it an assignment that no one in the Queen's former household wants, an assignment that will place Cecily closer to Anne Boleyn's final days than she has ever wanted to be. You might survive the interrogation, but then comes the assignment no one wanted. The order arrives 10 days after Anne Boleyn's arrest, delivered without warning or explanation beyond the bare instruction itself. Cecily is to report to the Tower of London, where she will join a small number of other women in attending the Queen during what remains of her imprisonment. The cruelty of this assignment, once Cecily understands its full shape, is almost impossible to overstate, and it is worth pausing to explain exactly why, because the mechanism of it reveals something especially dark about how Cromwell chose to manage this entire process. The women selected to attend Anne Boleyn in the Tower were not chosen because they were her friends, her confidants, or the ladies she might have wished to have beside her in her final days. They were chosen, in several documented cases, because they were women with whom Anne had strained or openly hostile relationships. Her own aunt, one of 2 women confusingly both known as Lady Boleyn, was assigned to her, a woman whose relationship with Anne appears to have been distant at best and actively critical at worst. Margaret Coffin, whose earlier role reporting the Queen's private words to Cromwell we have already discussed, remained at her side. The wife of the Constable of the Tower himself, Lady Kingston, was also present, a woman with no prior personal relationship to the Queen at all, chosen purely for her husband's official position and her own presumed loyalty to the Crown rather than to the prisoner she now attended. Anne herself recognized immediately what this arrangement signified, and her recorded reaction, preserved in letters that the Constable of the Tower wrote to Cromwell throughout her imprisonment, carries a bitterness that centuries have not dulled. She complained, according to Kingston's own account, that it was unkind of the king to place around her women whom she had never loved, women who could tell her nothing of her own father, nothing of what was happening beyond the walls that now enclosed her entire existence. She understood, with the sharp political intelligence that had carried her from minor gentry to the throne of England, that she had been surrounded not by comfort, but by surveillance, that every word she spoke in what should have been her most private and vulnerable hours was being recorded, weighed, and transmitted directly to the men who intended to destroy her. Cecily's specific assignment placed her among this group, though her presence appears to have been intended less as a deliberate act of cruelty toward Anne specifically, and more a simple administrative necessity. The Tower required attendance for a queen who could not, even in disgrace, be left entirely without female service, and Cecily, having already been questioned and having offered testimony that satisfied her interrogators, was considered safe enough, reliable enough, to be trusted with this task. The reality of the assignment, once Cecily arrives, proves to be a form of psychological ordeal that she could not have adequately imagined beforehand. Anne Boleyn, confined to the same apartments where she had once awaited her own coronation 3 years earlier, in circumstances of unimaginable triumph and celebration, now exists in a state that oscillates between eerie composure and moments of genuine emotional collapse. She speaks, according to the accounts that survive, almost obsessively, filling the silence of her confinement with a stream of remembered conversations, defensive explanations, sudden bursts of nervous laughter, and equally sudden collapses into tears. Cecily's actual task, though never stated in these explicit terms, is to listen to all of it. Every word Anne speaks, every emotional swing, every fragment of memory or self-justification is meant to be observed, remembered, and reported to Kingston, who transmits the substance of it to Cromwell. Cecily finds herself in the surreal and deeply disturbing position of serving as a kind of human recording device for a woman's unraveling, tasked with capturing every unguarded word that might later be used, in whatever form, against the very woman she is nominally serving. The sensory details of this period are worth dwelling on, because they convey something that abstract political history cannot. The Tower apartments, though comfortable by the standards of actual imprisonment, carry a persistent dampness, the distinct cold smell of ancient stone that never quite warms, even with fires burning in every hearth. The sound of the river is audible from certain windows, along with the calls of the ravens that have always inhabited the Tower grounds, a sound that Cecily will associate for the rest of her life with this specific period of dread. There is very little for the women to do beyond sit with Anne through her long, circling monologues, offer what comfort seems appropriate without appearing to encourage her, and wait. Anne's moods, as recorded across the surviving letters that Kingston sent to Cromwell throughout this period, shift with a rapidity that Cecily finds almost impossible to anticipate. There are hours when the Queen speaks with what appears to be genuine calm, discussing scripture with her chaplain, expressing confidence that God will judge her innocence, even if her earthly judges will not. There are other hours, arriving without warning, when she is overtaken by a kind of manic energy, laughing at jokes only she seems to find funny, recounting fragments of court gossip as though nothing has changed, as though she might simply resume her former life the moment this unpleasant misunderstanding is cleared away. And there are the darkest hours, which Cecily finds hardest to witness, when Anne weeps without restraint, asking questions that no one in the room has the power to answer. Whether her daughter Elizabeth is being cared for properly, whether her father has abandoned her, whether the king himself, the man she loved and married and gave a child to, truly believes the charges being levelled against her, or whether he understands, somewhere beneath the political necessity driving this entire process, that the woman he is preparing to kill is innocent of what she stands accused. Cecily learns during these weeks an entirely new register of listening, one that goes beyond the careful discretion she had already mastered during her 2 years of ordinary court service. She learns to absorb information without visibly reacting to it, to hold a woman's grief and desperation at a professional distance, even as some part of her, the part that is simply a young woman witnessing another young woman's unraveling, aches with a sympathy she is careful never to display. She learns, too, the specific exhaustion of constant vigilance, the way that spending every waking hour attentive to another person's emotional state, ready to report or respond as circumstances require, drains something from a person that sleep alone cannot restore. The food brought to the Tower apartments during this period arrives with a strange formality that Cecily finds almost surreal given the circumstances. Anne, despite her imprisonment, continues to be served according to protocols befitting her former rank. Multiple courses, wine, delicacies prepared in the Tower's own kitchens by cooks who have presumably been instructed that a queen, even a queen awaiting trial, must not be seen to be treated as a common prisoner. Anne eats little of it. Cecily watches her push food around silver plates during meals that stretch on in uncomfortable silence. The elaborate presentation of each course serving only to underscore the strangeness of a woman being fed like royalty while awaiting a fate that will strip her of every privilege that royalty confers. On the 15th of May, 13 days after her arrest, Anne is brought to trial in the King's Hall within the Tower itself, before a jury of 27 peers of the realm. Cecily is not present in the hall itself, this being a formal proceeding that does not require the attendance of the Queen's personal women, but she waits, along with the others, for news of the verdict. And the news, when it arrives, surprises no one, though it devastates everyone who has maintained any hope that reason might yet prevail. Anne is found guilty of all charges. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presides over the proceedings and pronounces the sentence himself, his voice, according to witnesses, breaking with what several observers took to be genuine grief, whatever his own complicated role in his niece's downfall may have been. The sentence, as pronounced, offers the king's mercy in the form of a choice between two methods of execution, burning or beheading, the king's pleasure to be made known in due course. This detail, chilling in its bureaucratic coldness, sits with Cecily for days afterward. The knowledge that the manner of a woman's death has been left as an open administrative question, to be resolved at the convenience of the very man who ordered her arrest. 2 days after Anne's trial, on the 17th of May, George Boleyn and the 4 men accused alongside the Queen, Norris, Weston, Brereton and Smeaton, are executed on Tower Hill. Cecily, along with several of the other women attending Anne, understands that the Queen herself is able to watch this execution from a high window in the bell tower, a detail that some historians consider unlikely, but which persists in several period accounts. Whether Anne actually witnessed her brother's death or only heard the confirmation of it afterward, the effect on her, as reported by those attending her, is one of profound and visible grief, followed, in the strange psychological pattern that seems to have characterized her final days, by an almost desperate curiosity about whether the men had, in their final speeches, said anything to affirm her innocence. That same day, Cecily learns something that adds an entirely new dimension of horror to the situation. Archbishop Cranmer, acting on grounds that remain debated by historians to this day, has declared Anne's marriage to the king null and void, retroactively erasing it as though it had never occurred. This means, in the strict legal terms that govern Tudor thinking about treason and adultery, that Anne cannot technically have committed adultery, since she was never legally the king's wife in the first place. The contradiction at the heart of this legal maneuver, condemning a woman to death for adultery while simultaneously declaring that she was never married and therefore could not have committed adultery, appears to trouble no one with the power to raise the objection. Cecily, hearing this news second-hand, understands with growing clarity that the entire process she has been witnessing has never had anything to do with actual justice. It has been, from the beginning, a machine constructed to produce a single, predetermined outcome, and the specific legal or logical mechanisms used to reach that outcome are, apparently, entirely interchangeable. On the 18th of May, word reaches the Tower that the execution, initially scheduled for that morning, has been postponed until the following day. The reasons given involved the delayed arrival of the executioner, a specialist swordsman summoned from Calais, at what the historical record suggests was considerable expense. The king having decided, in what several accounts describe as a final gesture of consideration, that his former wife should die by sword rather than by the common English axe, a method reputed to offer a swifter and less painful death. Cecily is present when Kingston delivers this news to Anne, and the Queen's reaction, as recorded in Kingston's own subsequent letter to Cromwell, is one of visible distress at the delay rather than relief. She had prepared herself, Kingston reports, for that specific morning, and the postponement disturbs her composure in a way that the original sentence itself, oddly, had not. The final night passes in a state that Cecily will never fully be able to describe to anyone who did not experience it alongside her. Anne spends much of the evening in prayer and conversation with her chaplain. She speaks at various points with what those present describe as remarkable calm, expressing forgiveness for those who have brought about her downfall and repeatedly affirming her innocence of the specific charges against her, while accepting, with what appears to be genuine spiritual resignation, that she must die according to the law and the king's judgment. Cecily remains close throughout this final night, one of a small number of women who do not sleep at all, who sit in the candlelit chamber, listening to a queen prepare for her own death with a composure that none of them can fully comprehend. There are moments, Cecily will later recall, when Anne turns to the women attending her and speaks with something approaching gentleness, telling them not to weep, reminding them that she goes to God with a clear conscience regarding the specific charges leveled against her, urging them to be brave, in a tone that suggests she understands, even in these final hours, that her own composure is itself a kind of gift to the frightened women around her, a final act of grace extended to people who have, in various ways, participated in the machinery that is about to kill her. Anne asks, at one point during the night, whether the men executed 2 days earlier said anything in their final speeches that might further clear her name, a question that Cecily finds almost unbearably poignant. This need, even now, even with her own death only hours away, to know whether justice has been done, whether the truth has been spoken somewhere by someone, even if it can no longer save her. Morning arrives on the 19th of May. Cecily helps Anne dress for the final time, and the choice of garments carries its own quiet, deliberate message. A gown of dark grey damask over a red kirtle, the colour choice interpreted by some later historians as a subtle assertion of martyrdom, red being associated with Christian sacrifice, though whether this symbolism was consciously intended or is simply the retrospective interpretation of later observers remains impossible to know with certainty. A mantle trimmed with ermine, the fur reserved for royalty, worn even now, even in these final hours, as a final assertion of the rank that the law has just stripped from her. The dressing itself, on any other morning a routine of practiced efficiency that Cecily could perform almost without thought, becomes, on this morning, an act that requires every ounce of composure Cecily possesses. Her hands, fastening the familiar laces and adjusting the familiar folds of fabric, tremble in a way she works desperately to conceal, aware that any visible distress on her part might further unsettle a woman who has, against all reasonable expectation, maintained her own composure throughout this entire ordeal. Anne, for her part, seems almost to be assisting her ladies rather than the reverse, offering small instructions in a calm, steady voice, as though dressing for an ordinary court occasion rather than for her own death. Anne receives the Eucharist that morning from her almoner, John Skip, and swears, according to Chapuis's later report of the event, upon the damnation of her own soul that she has never been unfaithful to the king. This detail carries enormous weight for those who later study this period, since a declaration made immediately before receiving the sacrament, staked upon the eternal fate of one's own soul, represented, in the religious framework that governed every aspect of Tudor life, the most solemn and binding assertion of truth available to any Christian. Cecily, present for this moment, understands its significance immediately, and it is this detail, more than almost anything else she witnesses in these final hours, that she carries forward as the clearest evidence of what she has always privately believed, that the charges against Anne Boleyn were never, in any meaningful sense, true. Anne spends part of the morning in a further, agonizing delay, the execution having been pushed back once more to allow sufficient witnesses to gather, since a spectacle of this magnitude, the first execution of an anointed Queen of England in the nation's history, requires an audience substantial enough to satisfy the political purpose it is meant to serve. Cecily watches the Queen absorb this second delay with visible, exhausted frustration, having been awake through most of the night and having, by every account, expressed a wish simply for the ordeal to be concluded. At last, sometime after 8 o'clock in the morning, word comes that the scaffold is ready. The walk from the Queen's apartments to Tower Green takes only a few minutes, a short distance that Cecily will later remember as having felt both instantaneous and impossibly long. Anne walks with a composure that draws comment from every witness whose account survives, her posture upright, her expression calm, betraying, according to those closest to her, none of the terror that surely must have accompanied every step. Cecily walks among the small group of ladies who accompany the Queen to the scaffold itself, a group that numbered 4 according to the clearest contemporary accounts, though their specific identities were not recorded with certainty by the observers present that day. The scaffold has been built high enough, according to the arrangements made in the preceding days, to ensure that the substantial crowd gathered on Tower Green can witness the proceedings clearly. This is not the larger, more public execution ground of Tower Hill, reserved for common traitors and public spectacle on a grander scale. Tower Green within the fortress walls offers a degree of privacy appropriate to Anne's rank, however meaningless that distinction may seem given what is about to occur. Anne addresses the assembled crowd with a short speech, one that survives in several near-contemporary accounts with only minor variations in wording. She speaks of coming to die according to the law by which she has been judged, and states that she will speak nothing against that judgment. She asks those present to pray for the king, describing him, in words that strike many listeners as remarkable given the circumstances, as a good, gentle, and sovereign lord. She commends her soul to God and asks for the prayers of all who have gathered to witness her death. Cecily stands close enough to hear every word, and close enough in the minutes that follow to witness what happens next with a clarity she will spend the rest of her life trying, without success, to forget. Anne's ladies step forward to assist her in the final preparations. Her mantle is removed. Her hood, the elegant French style she has favoured throughout her years as queen, is taken off, and her dark hair, loosened from its usual careful arrangement, is gathered and tucked beneath a plain linen cap, the practical necessity of keeping it clear of the blade overriding, in this final moment, every consideration of vanity or dignity that might otherwise have applied. Anne pays the executioner herself, a customary practice for those facing execution in this period, a small purse handed over with what witnesses describe as remarkable steadiness, and the swordsman, according to the accounts that survive, begs her forgiveness for what he is about to do. There is no block. The French style of execution that Henry has arranged, a final mercy layered atop an otherwise merciless proceeding, requires the condemned to kneel upright rather than to lay their neck across a wooden block in the manner of the standard English axe execution. Anne kneels in the straw that has been scattered across the scaffold platform, and one of her ladies binds a blindfold over her eyes. What follows takes only seconds, though the account that survives, describing the executioner's technique, adds a detail that makes those final seconds almost unbearable to consider closely. The swordsman, trained in a specific method intended to catch the condemned unaware and thereby ensure the cleanest possible strike, calls out to his assistant for his sword, though the sword is already in his own hand, concealed from view. The purpose of this call is to cause the kneeling, blindfolded prisoner to turn her head slightly toward the sound, an instinctive, human reaction that exposes the neck at precisely the angle required for a single, clean stroke. Anne, praying continuously in these final moments, turns her head toward the sound of the executioner's voice. The blow falls in a single stroke. Cecily does not look away. This is, perhaps, the detail that stays with her longest in the years that follow. She had believed, in the days leading up to this moment, that she would somehow manage to close her eyes, to spare herself the final image. But in the moment itself, she finds herself unable to do so, watching everything with the same terrible attentiveness that has characterized her entire service in this household, the same trained inability to look away that has defined every moment of her position from the very first day she arrived at court. What follows requires of Cecily and the other ladies present a task that combines grief, horror, and practical necessity in a way that almost defies description. There has been, in the chaos and haste of the preceding days, no provision made for Anne's burial. No coffin has been supplied. Whether this represents genuine oversight, given how quickly the final arrangements were assembled once the executioner finally arrived, or whether it reflects a deliberate, final indignity, the historical record does not definitively resolve. What is certain is that Cecily and the other women, weeping, their hands shaking, are left to gather the Queen's remains themselves, wrapping her head and body in white cloth, while officials of the Tower scramble to locate some suitable container. Cecily's hands, performing this task, move with a strange, dissociated steadiness that she will later find difficult to explain, as though some part of her mind has stepped back from the immediate horror of what she is doing in order to allow the rest of her to function at all. She has dressed this woman 1,000 times. She has fastened her sleeves, arranged her hair, adjusted her hood before 100 banquets and audiences. And now her final act of service is this: gathering what remains of a body that was, only minutes before, speaking, praying, alive. and folding white linen around it with the same careful attention she once brought to arranging a court gown. The other women work alongside her, in a silence broken only by muffled weeping, none of them speaking, none of them needing to speak, the horror of the task itself requiring no commentary. A tower official, visibly flustered by the absence of any prepared receptacle, disappears for several minutes into the depths of the fortress, returning eventually with the solution that history has recorded. What is eventually found is an old elm chest, previously used to store arrows in the tower armory, its interior still carrying presumably the faint smell of old wood and stored weaponry. Into this chest, Anne Boleyn's remains are placed, and the chest is carried the short distance to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small church that stands within the tower precincts, where a grave has been hastily prepared beneath the stone floor near the chancel, in proximity to the remains of her brother George, executed only 2 days before. There is no formal funeral service in the manner that would have accompanied the death of an actual queen. There is no procession, no state mourning, none of the elaborate ceremonial apparatus that Tudor culture typically deployed to mark the death of anyone of significant rank. Anne Boleyn, having been retroactively declared to have never truly been the king's wife at all, is buried as what the law now considers her to be, a convicted traitor, disposed of with the minimum ceremony that circumstances require. The chapel itself, small and cool and dim even at midday, offers no grandeur befitting the woman now being lowered into its floor. Only the plain stone and the modest altar of a fortress church built for garrison worship rather than royal commemoration. Cecily stands in the small chapel as the makeshift coffin is lowered into the ground, her own body trembling with a combination of shock, exhaustion, and grief that she has not yet had time to process, let alone understand. She has served this woman in various capacities for 2 years. She has dressed her, attended her, listened to her private conversations and her most desperate final ramblings, and she has just watched her die by the single stroke of a foreign swordsman's blade. And now, within the space of a single morning, she is expected to simply continue. Let us step back now from the scaffold and the chapel, and let us look at the broader canvas, because there are patterns here worth naming, patterns that stretch far beyond this single terrible morning in May. The first pattern concerns the peculiar cruelty of Tudor political violence, which rarely announced itself as violence at all. What happened to Anne Boleyn, and to the women who served her, was accomplished almost entirely through paperwork, testimony, legal proceeding, and the careful management of appearances. There was no mob, no riot, no chaotic eruption of popular fury. There was a trial, conducted with all the formal apparatus of English law, a jury of peers, a pronounced verdict, a king's mercy exercised in the selection of the method of death. Every step of the process wore the costume of legitimate justice, even as the substance beneath that costume had almost nothing to do with actual guilt or innocence. This is a pattern that recurs throughout Tudor history and, frankly, throughout the history of authoritarian power more broadly. Violence dressed in the language of law is not less violent for the dressing. It is, in some ways, more insidious, because it teaches everyone watching that the forms of justice can be maintained even as the substance of justice is entirely hollowed out. Consider how thoroughly this pattern extended even to the smallest procedural details. Cranmer's declaration that the marriage had never legally existed, issued just 2 days before the execution, served no practical purpose beyond theatrical consistency, since Anne was condemned regardless of her marital status, and the annulment changed nothing about the sentence already passed. Yet the annulment was pursued anyway, argued and formalized with the same careful legal precision that governed every other aspect of the proceedings, because the appearance of procedural correctness mattered to this system, independent of whether that procedure produced any coherent or defensible outcome. A government capable of maintaining this level of bureaucratic thoroughness in service of an outcome this unjust reveals something important about how administrative competence and moral catastrophe can coexist within the very same institution, wielded by the very same hands. The second pattern is the specific vulnerability of women whose status depended entirely on their relationship to men. Cecily's position, her safety, her family's prosperity, all of it existed only because of her placement in a household that depended on the continued favor of a king who could, and did, dispose of that household with a stroke of the pen. Anne Boleyn herself, despite occupying the highest position available to any woman in England short of being born a princess in her own right, possessed no independent power base capable of protecting her once the king's favor withdrew. Every woman in this story, from the queen herself down to the most minor lady-in-waiting, existed within a structure of dependency that made genuine security impossible. Marriage, family connection, royal service, none of these provided the kind of stable ground that might have allowed any of these women to resist the machine that eventually consumed them. The third pattern is the way that ordinary human behavior, courtly flirtation, sharp wit, sibling affection, was retroactively reinterpreted as evidence of monstrous crimes. Anne's relationship with her brother George, which, by every account prior to 1536, appears to have been simply a close and affectionate sibling bond, common enough in a family that had risen together and depended on mutual support, was transformed, through nothing more than accusation and the absence of any genuine counter-evidence, into a charge of incest. Her participation in the conventional, centuries-old game of courtly love, a game she had played with skill and enthusiasm for years without incident, became evidence of systematic adultery. This pattern, the retroactive criminalization of previously acceptable behavior once a target has been selected for destruction, is one of the most chilling and most enduring features of authoritarian systems throughout history, and it appears here, in 1536, in nearly its purest and most devastating form. The fourth pattern concerns the specific psychological burden placed on witnesses, the women like Cecily who were neither perpetrators nor primary victims, but who were forced, through their position of unavoidable proximity, to participate in a process they had no power to resist and only limited power to shape. Cecily's testimony, offered as carefully and honestly as she could manage, became raw material for a prosecution she did not support and could not have stopped. This is a burden that history rarely acknowledges adequately. The specific trauma of bearing witness to injustice while possessing no meaningful ability to prevent it, and being required, moreover, to actively participate in its documentation. The fifth and final pattern, perhaps the most quietly devastating of all, is the sheer speed with which the machinery of court life resumed its normal function after catastrophe. Within days of Anne's execution, the practical business of running a royal household continued. A new queen would need attendants. The daily rhythms of dressing, serving, and attending would need to resume. For someone, regardless of who had occupied that role only weeks before. The court's capacity to absorb even the most extreme violence and simply continue operating as though nothing exceptional had occurred tells us something essential about how power actually functions. It does not pause for grief. It does not build in space for reckoning. It simply moves forward, and the people who lived through the catastrophe are expected to move forward alongside it. Let us return to Cecily now, because her story, like the stories of the other women who survived this period, did not end at the graveside. It continued in a way that captures perhaps the strangest and most disorienting aspect of this entire history. Cecily returns from the tower to her lodgings within the wider palace complex that same afternoon, still wearing the gown she wore to witness the execution, still carrying, though she does not yet fully register it, a kind of numb shock that will not begin to lift for many days. She removes the gown that evening, folding it carefully despite everything because the fabric is valuable and her family's finances do not permit careless treatment of good cloth, regardless of what that cloth has witnessed. She washes. She sleeps, or attempts to, in a bed that feels unfamiliar after weeks spent on a pallet in the tower, in rooms haunted by a woman's unravelling and a violence that Cecily cannot yet fully process. Good evening. Find a comfortable position and let the room go quiet. If you are winding down for the night, this is a good place to do it. Let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and let me take you somewhere far from here, somewhere with stone walls and candlelight, and a specific kind of fear that most of us, thankfully, will never have to know. Tonight we are going to the English royal court in the spring of 1536. Specifically, we are going to stand in a corner of the Queen's bedchamber, hands folded, eyes down, wearing silk you did not choose, and serving a woman whose fate you cannot control and cannot escape. You are a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne Boleyn. It is, on paper, one of the most prestigious positions available to a woman in England. It will also, within a matter of weeks, become one of the most dangerous. We are not going to rush toward the ending. We are going to walk through it slowly, the way this story actually unfolded, hour by hour, whisper by whisper, so that by the time we arrive at Tower Green, you understand exactly what it cost the women who stood there. Get settled. The fire is low. We have all night.